Welcome back, ladies and germs, to another scintillating tale on Never Stay Dead. Two rivals enter the ring. In one corner, you have standing at 6'10", gleaming muscles, brilliant mind, your primary host.
Xavier? Charles Xavier?
Yeah, Matthew, me.
Oh, and Matthew. I didn't realize. I didn't see your gleaming muscles.
Yeah, it doesn't come across on the camera. And
you
on
should
the
take
microphone.
Your shirt off more often, I guess. There are people who wish for that.
It's true. And in the other corner, at a 3'5", Bugs Bunny muscles.
I come from the House of X.
Yeah.
But you have the powers of 10.
There we go. Mr. Damian. Boo.
We are back. And I've been predicting that the comic book world is going to hate me after this episode. If any of them listen.
Of course.
So tonight we're going to talk about the complete House of X, Powers of X, or Powers of 10, pardon me. The miniseries by Jonathan Hickman and several artists.
But yeah, discussing this Hickman reinvention of the X-Men and kind of this prelude to the new Age of X. Or not Age of X, very aptly.
Do they have a title for the overhaul of the X-Men, or is it just
Dawn of X or something? I don't know. They've blown through so many. Who can keep them straight?
I've heard people say that.
I
mean, this is not. This is what's the term? Not a reboot, but a retrofit. There's a term for it.
Retcon?
Retcon. It's a retcon of the X-Men in a sense. It's both a retcon and a going forward.
Yeah,
a starting point for going forward from.
Well, and the device by which they do so is intriguing and core to this chunk of comics we're talking about. So I feel like I should try to do the summary here.
Okay. Can I just say, because I know occasionally there are people listening who aren't, deeply invested in Marvel comics or maybe even know anything about them. They brought in a superstar writer from the past, the recent past, to come back to Marvel and reinvigorate the X-Men, which used to be Marvel's major franchise, which Marvel then kind of let go of for a while because of wanting to make the Inhumans more popular. So now they're sort of reinvesting in the X-Men by bringing in this superstar writer to kind of both kickstart everything and also be kind of the showrunner for all the other writers now writing the X-Men.
Is that right?
I think so.
I don't know how the office or all that breaks down.
I was just trying to set the stage a little bit for people who maybe don't read a lot of Marvel or know the Marvel history.
Okay, yeah. So as with everything X-Men, which is part of what's kind of confounded them for the last decade, if you don't know anything about the X-Men, even trying to access this story is difficult.
The X-Men have massive, confusing continuity and character, and massive number of characters, and massive alternate histories and timelines, yes. And
all of them intersect in some form of a main character in one moment or another. So it's, I'd argue, the second most convoluted group or franchise to follow in comic bookdom.
The second?
Yes.
I'm wondering who the first is.
After the Legion.
The Legion. But the Legion doesn't have... The Legion is certainly complex and has many reboots and such. But it doesn't have... To me, it doesn't have the intensity of the continuity and the complexity of the timelines, and I don't know. But anyway, that's arguable. Anyway, it's one of the most complicated.
Right. I think the Legion's more complicated to me because it's more boring, so it's harder to try to figure out. So
no insult to our Legion friends out there, but it is kind of less complicated. I think there's less going on, so that might be why it's more boring for you.
Maybe. I don't know. But also I've been invested in X-Men for a long time. So I can't even do this general explanation of the story without doing some form of spoiler, I don't feel.
Yeah, I think we have to spoil this to talk about it.
Like, even from the jump, right? So...
Yeah.
Because it's all told, like... We'll get to the structure of the book in a little bit. But,
why don't you try to summarize it, and maybe I go after you've done it. If I think there's anything else, I can throw a few things in.
Right. So...
But give it a shot.
There's a character, Moira, who is reclassified here as Moira X, who lives a life, and then when she dies, she is reborn with full memory of her previous lives as she continues. And so she learns from them each time. And ultimately...
One thing that confused me, so I just want to clarify for anyone listening, I'm sorry for interrupting already, is she relives the same life. So let's say, for instance, she's born in 1980. She's reborn again in 1980. It's not your regular reincarnation where you move on to the next life. She redoes the same life, but with the memories of the first time she did it.
And each life, etc. Yeah. So she's born at the same point, but... So through these lives, she kind of has her normal, and where we knew her as kind of the mother of Prometheus and all this through normal X-Men lore, through like the Claremont years or whatever. Then we hear about this life where she followed Xavier, kind of from the jump, one where she followed Magneto from the jump, one where she followed Apocalypse from where she could. And there's some others mingled in there about her learning, developing more on her own rights. But this life, and this is what triggers the entire moment, which the entire moment of this new X line doesn't even come in till the second issue of Powers of X, I don't think.
Yeah, which was the third issue that I read.
Right.
In my order of reading.
Yeah.
I think. I'm a bit confused. I read this in trade, and Matt read it in individual issues.
Which gave me some freedom to do it the right way. So...
And she's lived 10 lives.
Right, so this is Moira X, Powers of X 10. That theme will come up a bazillion times. She has convinced Xavier to abandon his dream, and Magneto to abandon his dream. And for both of them to kind of do something different to survive, because what they find is in the end the mutants, however you look at that, always lose, and it tends to be to humans and robots, and kind of an anti-life in a way, if you will. And some of it gets bleak and esoteric and very sci-fi, and some of it's more definite and within alternate terrible X-Men futures that we've witnessed in one form or another. So the impetus of her dream and where this carries forward is that the mutants are to establish their own nation on the mutant island of Genosha. And
Krakoa.
Yes, Krakoa. Why did I say Genosha? Because I'm confusing.
Because they previously had a mutant nation called Genosha.
Yeah, because...
I don't know if it was on Krakoa or...
Because that's one of the things I'm trying to keep in mind, talking about Genosha, because that's where Emma Frost comes in, which I think is super important to this. But, okay, so they're on Krakoa. Sorry, I misspoke. And they are being nationalists. They are mostly, I wouldn't say isolating themselves from the world, but they're creating their own nation where only mutants are allowed in. And then they're trying to export things out. And they're trying to establish their new rules. And right before the dawn of the announcement of this nation, they take their first shot against the robotic side of humanity in what is a death run for the X-Men. And after
for a
that
team of the X-Men, right?
Right. Um, and yeah, so from there, you kind of get this baptized in blood birth of a nation where it starts becoming more of a political thriller, which is interesting. I feel like that's the best way to kind of set it up without diving too deep into any detail to overview it.
Well, so as I understood it, Moira is shaping and reshaping history and like doing an experiment where you try it again and again till you get it right with each lifetime.
Mm-hmm.
And so by the 10th lifetime, apparently she's succeeded in making everything fall into place for what she needs, which is Professor X and Magneto working together with the mutant island Genosha, which I guess is a sentient Krakoa. Sorry, now I
messed you up.
The sentient. I could have easily done it myself. They're working with this sentient island that gives them all kinds of special advantages, including teleportation flowers that only will let through people with the mutant X gene, and giving them special drugs created from other flowers that they can use as bargaining trips, sort of super drugs that they can, that will get rid of diseases and cancer and stuff that they can use to leverage their political power.
Well, yeah. So these gates are being established across the world that allow the transportation. So mutants basically just need to reach these gates and they can jump through, and others can't. Now, how it knows Cyclops from Spider-Man is technically the X gene.
I guess there's a difference in the genes between the Spider-Man's
right.
Spider-Man's mutated genes and their regularly mutated genes. The definitions of mutant are very vague when you start thinking about it too much. And some mutants' powers seem to be basically magic, and some seem to be science. And obviously, you can't really mutate into magic.
I'll tell that to
But this
magic.
Reincarnation that Moira does seems like magic to me. Right, and there's a character called Magic there. So that this mix of magic and science as part of mutation has been in the X-Men for a long time, although they always claim it's kind of science fictional. But So another thing, speaking of magic or science, is they discover. This is a point I got very confused about, like the timeline of it. Like, when did they start figuring this out? But they discover they can use these golden balls as eggs to create new bodies for the mutants who have died and bring back their minds, which have been recorded in the Cerebro. I don't ever know. Cerebro?
Mark 3. Yes, Cerebro.
Have been recorded by Professor X in the Cerebro. So he's recorded millions of X-Men minds, and he can reincarnate them. So this seems to be a play on the fact that all these characters always come back to life. So now we're just admitting they have this technology to bring every single mutant back to life when they have the time to do it.
Well, and so they're getting around to it too. It's super weird how they're going about it. It's interesting, and part of it is to give Gold Balls a place in all this and give some meaning to his powers. Because originally Gold Balls was a Bendis invention. His whole point was his mutant powers. He could make these golden balls appear out of nowhere, and what do they do? Not much. But he became a very beloved character.
Almost a comic relief character or something. But now suddenly he's key. But
yes.
So he must just spend all day making golden balls to bring back all the mutants back to life.
Well, him and so Hope is in there as kind of allowing the other powers in this to work together. There's Prometheus in there to alter the reality within these to make it work. And then there's another mutant that's essentially like time warping them so that they come out at this optimal age, as opposed to just being newborn clones. Which, given Marvel pseudoscience up to this point, I feel is unnecessary due to the work of Miles Warren. But I guess we can skip over that.
Yeah, there always seem to be aged up clones whenever they need them in the Marvel Universe.
Yeah.
So it seems like maybe it's hard to break this down, but maybe there's three main threads, which one is the establishment of the nation. Do they call the nation Krakoa? The establishment of the mutant nation Krakoa, on Krakoa, and how all of that works with the teleportation and the golden balls bringing back people to life. And the theme of we're superior to you humans. We're going to be nice to you now, but we're telling you we're eventually going to take over the world, and the world is ours. And we're keeping separate, and we're not going to take any of your bullshit. And, there you are. And then there's the thread of how all of this was done through the constant reincarnation of Moira. I wish I could remember Moira's original last name.
McTaggart, I believe.
Moira McTaggart. There you go. And then there's this other kind of wilder and harder to follow plot about the idea of machine evolution, which ultimately leads to these godlike minds that live inside of black holes and absorb other civilizations once they reach a certain level of machine evolution. And while the X-Men may have stopped the machine evolution on our planet for now, it sounds like kind of an inevitable thing that eventually takes over the entire universe.
Right. There's a lot.
Don't know how that plays out.
Well, and so that's kind of the play of the titles, right? There's the House of X, the rise of the mutants as this nation, as this force. And then there's the Powers of 10, where they're talking about stopping the robots now. But the problem about artificial intelligence and all that is that it grows at an exponential rate. And so...
And these exponential godlike beings already exist all around us in the universe. They just haven't absorbed Earth yet. Right, so they're there. They're not created by the machines on Earth originally. They're created by other civilizations too. Every civilization ends up becoming one of these, hyper godlike machine minds living inside a black hole.
Well, and what's really interesting about that is it ties a lot of threads of some of the more bizarre X-Men stuff together in a weird way that actually creates a kind of stronger continuity of theme that gives the X-Men a more blatant arch nemesis, especially since they're removing kind of the Xavier Magneto dynamic and making it more this biology versus machines. But in that, it's the Sentinels and all iterations of the Sentinels, and kind of gives the Powers of 10 theme from like the old clunky robots of old to the Omega Sentinels kind of introduced during Operation Zero Tolerance in the 90s, which were kind of humans retrofitted to be Sentinels that were deadlier and scarier, of course. To introducing that mixed with the Phalnix, which was more of a sci-fi concept that played more in like the New Mutants, I believe, and other like Shi'ar technology and all that kind of blended together. But they also take advantage of this technology too as part of their rebirth initiative, which I thought was really fascinating.
Well, what puzzles me, and maybe so, first of all, I have a lot of ignorance here because I basically stopped reading the X-Men in the mid-'80s. I tried a little bit when Jim Lee was doing them, but I didn't really understand what was going on. And then I came back and read the Josh Whedon, and I read the Grant Morrison runs, but other than that, it's all stuff I haven't read.
Right.
So maybe a lot of this rests on the continuity from the periods that I did not read X-Men. But the concept that there's these phalanx things out there, it just seems to make meaningless all the other struggles. Even the Shi'ar and all of that are meaningless compared to these giant, all-consuming intelligences. And everything else in the Marvel Universe, even the Celestials, are small compared to the Phalanx people.
Well, the Phalanx was kicked up here in kind of this final like post-future act to be that bizarre threat. Which I've noticed this, and Hickman is guilty of this because he's now done it with the Avengers, the X-Men, and the Fantastic Four, where Marvel will present this like huge threat at some point, like way in the future, and it's so domineering and so powerful, and then the only people to fight it or survive it are the people of the title involved and not the Marvel universe. Right. And so it just kind of splinters the idea of that shared universe in a very weird way. So that was one of my least favorite parts of this.
Right.
And frankly, the robotics part, I like the general theming of it, I kind of liked, but anytime we jumped past the now present, I kind of tuned out because I don't care. Because so it's interesting that you have Moira X going, and in a very early life of hers that's shown here, she actually struggles against the mutants, trying to stop them. And Mystique and Destiny are the ones who end up killing her. And Destiny gives her this speech about like how, you know, we're forever linked. And all this weird bits about precognition and all that versus her living her life. But I mean, she'll have to learn every time. It's a weird juxtaposition. So when they establish the nation, they say no precogs are allowed on the island because they would know that everything they're building is destined to fail. Which is fascinating. But also this idea of someone who's living infinite lives ultimately is only feared by someone who can predict the future. Because in a weird way, that person has a glimpse over the one part that this person doesn't have, because they almost have dominion over the past because they were able to engineer their little section of the world the way they want.
Right.
Super high level kind of sci-fi concepts going on there, which I appreciated.
Tons of great concepts, but to me, they all bump into each other. We were just talking about how the machine, the machine singularity, so to speak, kind of makes everything seem pointless. But also this idea of all of the mutants can be endlessly reborn. Even if you take away one's questions about the mechanism, because these people have to make 1,000 people a day come back to life. They're going to spend the rest of their lives just doing that. But so now Moira X can live forever.
Well, she can, but then she can only live within this timeline. So
if she gets reborn look, what happens when she dies? She goes back, but at the same time, they make a copy of her and download her brain into that copy.
See, here's kind of the fun where I'm willing to throw a lot of that sort of stuff a line here, is this is launching a new era for the X-Men. Supposedly Hickman has plans for a decade. I doubt sales will allow that, but we're a few months into it relatively. Like, we're not as many issues into the books as long as these miniseries has run.
Right. And you have read many of the X books that came out of this, and I have
after.
Not. Everyone.
Yep.
How many titles is that? 6?
I don't know. Too many.
Or 10?
I'm not. It should be, shouldn't it? Guess it's Marvel shooting for at this point, because these things are selling like hotcakes.
Well, in those and Marvel likes to, strike while the iron is hot in spades. So they're gonna put out a ton of books now, but inevitably a lot of them will fall to the side and they'll move on to something else. But so in the books that came since, is there issues of the Phalanx? And
of course not. That's going to be more of an endgame thing.
Right. But do people are people constantly being brought back to life?
Yes. So, like I said, there's this death run in this comic where it's a lot of the big names and a couple that I'd never heard of before, because it's X-Men. There's always some character you've never heard of.
Right.
And
even you.
It's funny seeing, different communities and how they go now, but the X-Men community is very welcoming when someone's like, who is this character? People don't get weird about it. They're just like, here you go. Here's the basic of what you need to know. And if you want to know more, like, here's a few issues. Because I think to be an X-Men fan is to kind of realize, like, it's just a never-ending sea of continuity and characters, and it's kind of fun because there's always something new, but also you're kind of expected to know more than you could ever rightfully know unless you're already a dedicated fan. So it's pretty...
So now we have a nation of superpowered, superior humanoids who never die, or don't necessarily have to die. They can all be reborn constantly.
But there is a loss in their death still.
And they are clearly superior to humanity.
Where's the tension in death in comics? You cannot.
No, where's
you
the tension
cannot. No. You can't just throw that against this, because that's...
Where's the tension when you've stated point blank that they are superior, they are better, they're going to win in the end, and they all live lives over and over again?
Because they've stated that their mission's going to fail. They've stated a number of political tensions. And if you care about this sort of stuff, what's always more interesting and more fun to read is the character interactions and what these characters do and their small victories or losses along the way.
But a lot of their differences have been taken away from them, too. So Professor X is no longer the idealist who wants to... have humans and mutants live together.
Oh, okay.
And
whoa. Hold on. That is a whole topic right there. So Professor X has given up that dream. Yes, because he's seen that it is doomed to fail.
And that was the dream that the entire X-Men were built on as a series from 1964 on, or whenever they started.
Sure. But also the metaphor of that idea of those who are different just integrating fully has proven to maybe not work out so well. And with the idea of mutants and how they've built it up, this idea of establishing a new nation to live in the world, but to be playing on this political level, which is a lot more where this sort of diversity stuff is talked about and moved on in this day, because with globalization, kind of things have happened in different ways. I don't know. It feels more present. It feels more apt to
Another
talk about
sort
now.
of staple of the X-Men is, for the most part, I mean, there's some mutants who don't, but they live among us, but they're different. So that it was a metaphor for racism or homophobia. You could view yourself, say you're Jewish and you're living in society and people don't know you're Jewish until some sign comes up like your Jewish name or something else. Or you're gay and you can pass for straight, but underneath you're gay. The mutants were a metaphor for all those things. What are they a metaphor for now as this separatist, superior, in almost every possible way, and economically more powerful and everything more powerful nation?
The way communities work online, which is where these conversations are being had now, where things are separate and they do interact together and then they move as a presence together outwards. It's a lot more how the conversation's being had now. And so it works in today's world.
Now the mutants represent one of the ugly facets of life.
Why does it have to be ugly?
They represent the separatist, leverage your power over your enemies, don't compromise, don't...
They are leveraging their power in offering people extended lives, more free of disease, and to help them live their best life as long as they're alive, and as long as they are willing to recognize their island and just allow them sovereignty and peace. They are offering the gift of a better, healthier life.
Yeah, but basically they're dominating the earth through that leverage.
Through peace.
So they're a fantasy of some group that doesn't like all the other groups separating themselves from that group. So, they seem to me to represent... This setup seems to represent a fantasy of what different currently unable to compromise political groups feel about each other, or the way the Israelis would like to treat the Palestinians, or the way the Palestinians would like to treat the Israelis. It seems to me to be all about, it seems to be the reverse of what the X-Men used to be about.
Well, that's going to be part of what's interesting about it, though. That's what makes this so daring, is this is pushing an idea of, can you have a nationalistic movement in a positive light? Can that be a good thing?
It's we are superior to the rest of the world now because we're comic book characters. We're going to do it in a nice way and give you drugs.
I mean,
to help you live a little bit longer, but we are superior to you and we're going to stay separate from you. This trend towards separatism, you know, like we have in the U.S. for the left and the right.
But look, so I'm kind of with you, and that's part of what I was worried about this book, and I actually had some of the reaction you had when I was hearing about it in general. In reading it, I find it a lot more fascinating. And what's really tipped me over to loving this idea and willing to see how it plays out is a lot in the books that have followed, and especially in Marauders. What you see and what you have to remember is, how are mutants being treated everywhere else in the world? How are these, how is this minority class being treated by the majority? Very poorly. Locked away in camps, ostracized, beaten. They're all that they want is to live well.
Right.
And
there's
in order
no
to do
good
that,
humans. There's no nice humans. Or
That's
there's no good liberals. If you're a conservative, all liberals are these weird freaks who will cheat you and rob you. Or if you're a liberal, all conservatives are these bad people.
Good people don't do that. You can have people fight for freedom, but ultimately it's those bad actors that leave the marks, if you will. It's not saying all humans are bad, and they intersect with that as well, but they also intersect with the political bit of people.
Where there's nowhere in this book that I read where they intersect with any idea of any humans being any good.
Really?
I can't think of a single scene. The only scene
What about
with
all
humans,
the political scenes?
Those all reveal that these people have bad motivations, and we're just going to force them to do what we want through our leverage. But they basically would.
They all have their own motivations, their own self-interests in mind. Does that make them bad, though?
Well, none of them want to do any good to any mutant.
They don't necessarily want to do bad to mutants either. It's a political discussion based on the power presented at the table. And that's the thing, when you're talking about it at this level, that's how it's talked about. That's how it's leveraged. That's how
a rationalization of what this is, which is a metaphor of separation.
Yeah, exactly. And
othering of all sides to each other.
Exactly. Can a nationalistic movement be positive? It's never been so in history. No, it's not
positive for the humans. It's said right in the book. The humans are toast. They just don't know it yet.
The very concept,
and they say we are superior.
The very concept of mutants existing in the Marvel universe means humans are over at a certain point. That is how evolution works. And that's something that's kind of being honored here, is this idea that, we want to play nice, but when we're talking about the pure nature of it, nature is violent inherently. So it's a certain recognition of that fact, but they try to do the best thing moving forward with it.
No, they're trying to do the best thing for their own group. That's all.
Well, and every human that's willing to let them be.
When do they say that? They don't know. We're going to use the leverage of these supposed good things we're giving to humans to control them. But other than that, we have no interest in them.
They offer them gifts, and it's presented as leverage. But, that's kind of like the debate of, is a good deed if the person who's doing the good deed gets any enjoyment or self-satisfaction out of it? Does it matter?
I don't know. This just seems to be an extension of all the ugly politics of the current moment. with no
Yes.
apologies, no attempt to make it better or care about it.
Well, should people be sorry for bettering their own lives? That's another thing kind of presented here as well.
But that's, that would be the excuse of any country that takes advantage of other countries.
That's the excuse of every punk rocker trying to eke out against the cops as well. That is the excuse of anyone who's playing against a position of power to take their own power.
But then you become the person in power, and you're using those same excuses. The people in power, your excuses become their excuses.
What happens when those who rebel have to wear the crown? That is one of the most fascinating stories that are rarely told, because usually the story ends the minute the rebellion wins.
But there's nothing positive here. It's all negative. So
I think that's
not
true.
A story of heroism. There's no heroism in this story whatsoever.
What about the moment with Wolverine and the children?
I don't remember that moment.
So when we finally are on Krakoa, the mutant children are brought on, they're playing, they are establishing themselves. You have so many mutants who have been essentially child soldiers coming in, and they're talking about feeling this just kind of moment of peace and serenity. There's a lot there. And the other factor, too, that's brought up very heavily in Powers of X is the idea of the mutant genocide that's taken place over the comics, where the mutant population was rising.
Right.
And then there's the incident at Genosha, which was Grant Morrison's run, which took it down. And then there was the, I forget what it's called, but when Scarlet Witch says no more mutants, and then they're brought down to the 199.
Right, and she uses her mutant magic power to take away the power of about 1 million remaining mutants.
Well, and that no more mutants can be born, and they aren't for years after. And then we slowly get introduced to a handful more mutants, but essentially, like, the population's been decimated to a point where they're on life support. They're barely surviving. And so now they're at a point where
it was to bring the mutant... I mean, from the writer's point of view, it was to bring things back to the early days of the X-Men, where it was easier to have plots and stuff, because you didn't have a nation of X. They were kind of regretting the whole Genosha thing. And because here's another thing, that Marvel Comics is the world outside your window. And if you take these ideas too far, you're so far away from our world, you're nowhere near the world outside our window.
Well,
and my friend Bob, Bullseye Bob, I've heard him on his YouTube channel, Everything Comics, say that he wonders if these X-Men books are now in a different universe than the rest of the Marvel universe. Because how would this line up with the rest of the Marvel universe and what's going on there?
The same way when Galactus comes crashing down, or when Spider-Man has some like world-ending event happen in New York that only affects everyone for 5 minutes, or any other number of cataclysmic things, or political.
Within this, there's Earth is humanity is no longer important, and at the same time, they don't have cancer and things like that.
You keep coming back to this, but by the very incident of mutants being the evolutional projection, that has been the case for the longest time, which has been the fear that like powered, the Purifiers are gaining Creed, or any number of the X-Men antagonists throughout the years, because they're afraid of that inevitability and what that means. But that's
why
new.
A lot of the big stories were, futures that may or may not happen and stuff, so that you could still keep the X-Men within the Marvel universe. It just doesn't make sense that any of this exists with the Fantastic Four and the Avengers and Spider-Man and the rest. And by the end of it, so I think, it makes a lot of sense too, because Moira has rewritten the reality 10 times. Mm-hmm. So in a sense, you could say we are in a different universe than other things.
I mean, you could say that from any... Well, I mean, Spider-Man has two of those major moments where that would affect everyone as well. Or Daredevil's had a couple.
You constantly have to kind of reset the Marvel Universe as only having, been around about 15 years. Mm-hmm. Or you get too much of a... So what Hickman's done is written this like a science fiction writer and just move on from there. And you move into the future. And there is the connection to the modern day is further and further removed. But it to me, it takes away any feeling of what Marvel Comics normally is, which, as I said, the world outside your window stuff. The feeling of the Marvel Universe being set in a somewhat close to our world.
I just don't think that's been Marvel's way for ever. I mean, once these characters kind of hit a scope, it just hasn't felt like that. Like Iron Man's had such a futurist bend since Fraction was on it that the technology was so beyond anything that we could fathom. And not just Iron Man, but what like Stark Tech introduces for the common consumer.
Yeah. And the same with the Fantastic Four. If you were realistic about all the technology they have brought into the world, we would be living in an entirely different world than we do.
Well, with the Fantastic Four, I talk about the reality bending stuff introduced regularly. I mean, they're dealing with things that would radically change. I mean, the way that they deal with exploration is so fantastic that it's incomprehensible if you're trying to bring it to the real world. Don't get me wrong; these are all fun stories. I love them.
All the technology that Mr. Fantastic invents and or borrows from aliens, as do the X-Men borrow stuff from aliens. But so the way that Marvel traditionally did it is these things are being done. There's a few mutants out there, and there's a few things that the Fantastic Four and Iron Man can do. But this is the whole world changing. And maybe that's been happening for a while in Marvel Comics, as you're saying, and now that it's come home to roost in this comic book, where it is a 100% science fictional world.
I think actually what's maybe triggering this thought more for you prevalently with this story is less the technological or the conceptual level, but the political level. What makes it feel grounded enough to actually feel different is the fact that this is intersecting with more real nations and more real, like, there's more grounded, there's more men in suits and power that have to contend with these things. There's kind of a real emotion to how they're throwing their power around that I haven't seen in kind of many comics before, unless it was in a very different setting.
I guess it's turning the metaphor of the X-Men into something 100% ugly and unpleasant. You could argue it's realistic and it's the way of the world, but it's not something I can relate to personally. I could relate, I'm not gay, but I could relate to that concept of being hidden and the struggle for identity and acceptance from the larger world. I am half Jewish, and I've experienced, being a quote hidden Jew, and I've experienced people finding out that I'm Jewish and then saying, "Oh, now I see it," and that kind of stuff. Yeah. So I at least have some clues of the African American experience and everything, but and I like when I read Malcolm X, I totally understood the desire for a completely separatist African state, but that's such a different and hopeful view of things to come from Marvel Comics that I was just kind of shocked where all this was going.
But on the other hand, what they're doing is they're bringing all their people together to talk through things, the good, the bad, the ugly. and
They're making
creating
laws
something.
for the mutant state,
Well,
but
they are, but also they're creating a culture their own. They're developing their own language. They're developing their own ideals, their own laws, their own kind of sense of morality, and they're trying to take what they know to be good and to be bad and forge something new. And I think
that is an interesting story.
Right.
It's definitely a massive change in direction for me. But of course, I haven't read all of the 90s and 2000s X-Men.
And what's also happening as a consequence, like this moment in this book is kind of a schism where they're playing really heavy into this separation thing. But the truth is like they still have to interact with the world. They are a nation in the world. And so there's still interaction dealing with it. And I think another thing that makes it more compelling is that I think there's a recognition of some of what you're talking about. One of the rules that they establish in the nation of 3 is they will not kill any humans.
Right.
The other is to get it on and make more mutants in a very interesting bit with Nightcrawler. Oh God, what was the other law? To cherish their landed people.
This book is so big, I can't find... There's pages which just state these laws, but I can't find them.
There are, and that's another thing that going a bit more straight to the comic side, is one thing that these comics do that's very Hickman-esque is they have pages where they break away and they have diagrams or little exposés or files that do a lot of exposition world building that would take pages of comics dialogue, but instead just kind of snap to get to an idea and you move on the story with more information. And this...
I was torn whether that was cool or lazy.
I think it's cool for a number of reasons. It allows more information to be presented more quickly. It allows the story to be strength where it can be strength, and it allows us to get more comic pages. Ultimately, we get a couple extra pages out of it, and the diagrams don't necessarily eat into that page count. So you get more for it.
I guess, but like all of this, going back to the robot the robot singularity and the phalanx and all of that, almost all of the explanation of all that science fiction is just in infodump text. And so if you skipped that stuff, it would really not make sense. It's really like, it's like Hickman had these ideas that he couldn't actually enact in a story on stage, so he just dumps them on you. And then for me, I'm left going, well, what am I supposed to do with this information? And because it seems, again, particularly with the robot stuff, it seems to just negate the meaningfulness of anything going on in the rest of the stories.
Well, I think part of the reason for that with the robotic growth, the reason it was presented that way is because it was to kind of get to the idea of the robots are growing AI internally. And so it is just kind of this robotic movement. It is just kind of a thing that happens in their progression. And then we get bits of those stories broken up within that. And I think that was the kind of theme. I agree. I think it's, again, the weakest and maybe the laziest part of this story. I also think it's the least significant because what it is doing is just presenting another alternate future in which they would fail. But ultimately, that's already been established within the story. And you could basically skip that chunk and not really lose any of the meaning in everything else, because the idea has already been established.
So say I didn't care about the Marvel Universe and the metaphors of the X-Men that I thought were really great things and positive. Say I didn't care about any of that, and say this is just a science fiction comic book that I'm reading. It's full of cool ideas, but it is enacted terribly. Large, hundreds of pages without any real characterization, except relying on characterization that people already know from previous X-Men reading. If I were to read this just as a science fiction novel by itself, I'd have no idea who these people were or their motivations. And they just sort of stand around and make grand statements, and then you move on to the next scene of people standing around making grand statements. And there's only a few little bits of the whole book that actually have action or interaction beyond just communicating Jonathan Hickman's big ideas.
So it's hard for me to talk to this because when it comes to X-Men, Spider-Man, or Ninja Turtles, I lack the ability to read it as if I was a new reader on any conceivable level, because these characters and ideas are so embedded in me that I can't forget on any level. But what I do know is that this refresh of X-Men has connected with so many people on such a level that wasn't just they picked up the comic, but they kept picking up the comics and they're reading more. And even people who aren't, grabbing everything want to read X-Men where they haven't been reading X-Men for years or at all.
Yeah. This was the most popular comic book series of 2019, I would say, overall.
Right.
And it brought a lot of people back to comic book stores, apparently. My comic book store owner has talked about that to me. It just leaves me puzzled as to how everyone got so much out of this.
So I think there's more in the characterization of it than maybe it looks at first blush, because I think some of it comes through.
Read it wrong.
Well, it's not that you read it wrong. It's just like there's some good moments with Cyclops, I know, where there's that whole bit where it's like right before they're going on the death march, essentially it's like what you need to do is impossible. Does it need doing? Then it will be done.
Right.
Like the consummate foot soldier.
The scene where that team goes off to some weird Sentinel outer space thing by the sun was one of the best acted out scenes in the book.
It's the only action scene in the book, really.
It's the only action scene in the book, and people are seemingly make a sacrifice, and we only find out afterwards they probably all knew they were going to be brought back to life. Or maybe they didn't know.
Well, I think they knew, but again, there's that loss of, I don't know how much it counts, but they do lose time, and there is something to that. But in that rebirth, there's also that rebirth ceremony where you have Storm kind of playing on a couple aspects of her previous character as the Queen and as the leader of the X-Men for a while. And in that, you kind of had this more... you talk about community and all this and what's positive for them. Like that is kind of a weird, cool scene that's completely new for the X-Men.
Storm is leading a giant crowd that is raising their fists into the air and shouting mutant.
Right.
So, yay, we've become like the Nazis.
Or any church gathering or any big communal thing where people are taking
pride in their culture.
A little more than
a church gathering, but maybe a Donald Trump rally. I don't know, but it's not a pretty sight for sensitive eyes. I don't know.
I don't know. You keep making all these negative allusions, but I've seen it. I understand what you're talking about, but I also have seen this done positively as well. It is groups of people working within themselves, building this identity. Like, it's culture.
But it seems like that kind of rally for the type of person we are always goes south in the end, because
it can be violent, but it can be positive as well, like Stonewall,
right,
or something. A
right.
lot of
and
its
the people
point of
at
view.
the Trump rallies will say, why can't we be proud of being white? As they all raise their fists together in unison. I don't think once you get, even if you're gay, once you get to the point where it's just all about gay pride and nothing else and no connection to the rest of the world, I think that's pretty sad. Which is, again, the situation here, because they're on their own special island that no humans can go on, and that will now dominate the earth. Or so it seems within these books. Now, you've read more, maybe it doesn't work out that way.
Well, they have their nation, but they're all doing different things. There's different characterizations. They all interact in different ways. In the New Mutants, they basically go off into space and have space adventures, so it almost has nothing to do with the rest of this.
Can they still be reborn?
I mean,
or are they too far off in space for that to work?
I mean, they could be reborn. It's just, would they know to rebirth them if they die in space? No one tells them, I guess. But that's the cool thing about the Cerebro 3.0 thing is, from a data center perspective, there's this bit where Xavier and Forge are talking to each other about developing this, and Forge is saying, well, for what you want to develop, I only see two problems. You need infinite storage capacity and infinite power.
Yes.
And Xavier has a coy smile because of the ties to the Shi'ar technology was also part of ultimately their doom. And also, interestingly, when you're talking about infinite power and storage data, ties directly into that powers of X and what is ultimately their downfall in that, like, you know, apocalyptic future there. So there's more connections being made here that I feel are going to present themselves as Hickman kind of weaves this tapestry forward. But it's fascinating to see that he's tackling it on so many levels. And I guess it's connected with a lot of people because it's compelling, it's interesting, it's new, it's fresh, it's doing a lot. But what I'm hearing is you're not liking it because every time you see something, you see this very negative allusion to something, which is something I can relate to you on because I was completely unable to access Secret Empire due to the way Nick Spencer wrote that at that time of that fever pitch. That was around the time of the election, and it was a Nazi Captain America, and I couldn't really get past it, but also that's what the book was about. And so, but there was no other aspects. There's no other angles. There was no twisting or play in that. It was just that.
Maybe this is just all about Brexit. And England would like to become Krakoa. They are an island after all, and they're trying to not be connected to the European Union. And keep their culture, you know, safe. I don't know. I can't stop going back to that as the basic metaphor for this book.
Brexit?
But so also, like, I couldn't get who is Professor X anymore. He struts around looking kind of odd, never taking his helmet off. And I don't know. They just walk around. Him and Magneto just walk around. I don't know. They just kind of walk around with no expressions on their faces. And part of the problem that goes to the lack of characterization and stuff is the way the art was, which is the kind of art where people have the same expression on their face panel after panel after panel. I guess because that's easier to do. They were really good at the big special effects, but the human faces and stuff, while kind of perfectly drawn, didn't do much in the way of acting or anything. Or did you not feel that?
I didn't feel that. I mean, you'll see, Xavier's face is somewhat obscured to be somewhat mysterious after the point of which the nation is founded, but not before. So there's something interesting there where he is he's purposely hiding himself in a way, even from those that he's around, because he has to kind of keep this poker face going, which is kind of the conceit of this whole thing. Which is interesting because it plays that idea of the leader who is setting up kind of this belief system and all this, but ultimately isn't going to believe it as fervently as those that he's raising with the belief, because that's all they know, and they don't have those doubts that come through the process of creation. I'm sure that's going to come to a head somewhere, especially as they're building, you know, the White King, the Red King, so on and so forth. And so I think also, like, there's that moment we were talking about Storm, and that was very expressive. There's a lot to the faces there. And I believe there's a lot of scenes with Magneto where he's talking to the politicians.
Sure, maybe I'm looking at the wrong scene with Storm, but I'm trying to hold this up to the screen that we're sharing.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you can see this picture there.
Yeah, I mean,
there's no expression on her face. Anyway.
Well, I mean, when she's talking and interacting with the various people, like when the one says, you know, like, don't touch me, and then she gets that big smile, and I know her, and all that. I mean, that's kind of also part of the idea of the speech too, is there's kind of the cold low and then the very expressive high.
So this has gotten you super excited for the X-Men, and I assume that even though it seems like, except for the far future doom of everybody in the entire universe,
well, that's just a good Marvel comic.
that it feels like at the end of this Hox Pox House of X, Powers of X hardback that I read, that there's really not a lot more story to tell. But obviously that's wrong, because there's already 6 or more issues. Did you feel like it was kind of complete as it was, or did you feel like it opened up a whole... It sounds like you felt differently on that level about it too.
Oh, definitely. Well, I mean, they're establishing a nation, and now they have to live with the consequences and live in the world of that idea and actually interact. And so, I mean, you're talking about isolationists and that they're
interact with each other or interact with the rest of the world.
Both. That's the fun of it. That's what makes this exciting, is it's a new status quo, and now what happens when you throw wrenches at it. And so, and for that, I mean, if you were to push on any book, I think you'd get the most out of Marauders, because it's basically the best one. But also it's the most gleeful of them, because it almost belies some of the points of this book. I also think it gets to some of the negativity that you're pushing on looking at is kind of, I think, some of the reality of being kind of the kingmakers, or playing at that political level, as opposed to the people being in a nation who are more in between. I mean, we start seeing some of these intersections where, like, Bobby Drake is interacting with his parents who are human, and so they're not on the island, but he can still go see them regularly, and so he visits. You have interactions with them saving mutants across the world still, and dealing with the political ramifications of the nations that don't recognize their sovereignty. And I do think one of the coolest parts in House of X was Cyclops interacting with the Fantastic Four over Sabretooth.
Right. That was pretty early on.
It was.
The superheroes, the rest of the superhero universe, to me, seemed to, except for a brief mention of Namor, seemed to disappear as the book continued.
Yeah, I mean, how much of the Marvel Universe interacts with any of these big plays, really, when you get down to it? There's usually your big shot of something happening with a lot of the characters, but I mean, that actual moment with the Fantastic Four is more than we normally get with some of these earth-shaking events.
What did you think of their punishment of Sabretooth?
That's like an original sin thing that's going to bite them in the arse. They literally take Sabretooth for being a murderous bastard, basically. Right. And because they won't kill him, they force him to exist in perpetuity at, like, the core of Krakoa. So he's just kind of encased in darkness and existing, but can't
do anything, but he's aware. So that's like the worst torture possible.
Right.
And for the sin of having killed some humans while on a mission they sent him on.
Yeah, but it's Sabretooth. It was a long time coming, as they all... Well, as his ex-wife and a number of people he's worked with in the past attest, yeah, screw this guy.
Right. I mean, obviously he has a long history of being a disgusting murderer.
But so does Wolverine, but they like Wolverine.
True. Yeah.
So do...
Yeah, somehow Wolverine's murders are okay.
And that's the thing about the X-Men, too, is most of them are usually a little bloodier than your average Marvel character. Like, Cyclops even has a bit of a body count.
When I was a kid, he managed to use his blasts, even though they constantly said he was the most powerful X-Men at the time, which is hard to believe now, but he would somehow use control his blasts, so he just stunned people.
Yeah, now Iceman's more powerful than Cyclops, even so.
Well, it's fascinating. I wonder if there's other people out here or if it's just me who's totally turned off by all of this. Because most people seem very turned on and excited by the X-Men.
I think the problem with maybe finding more naysayers is this isn't like just a shifting of the guard. It's that X-Men really compressed for a long time by Marvel's design. Like, they couldn't just kill off the X-Men because it was selling so well. but then they kind of threw that Inhumans bit that you were talking about earlier at it.
Right.
And then it was kind of maligned, and there's a lot of editorial pressure on X-Men. And in my mind, the basically last 2 runs before this weren't helping matters any. And so X-Men's just kind of existed, and there's definitely your diehard fans that have kept going. But this was such a revitalization of something that was so beloved, but hasn't really had that moment in such a long time, that this blew up beyond anyone's expectations.
I suppose you could view another way to view this as a metaphor of the geeks. When I was a kid reading comics, you had to stay hidden like the X-Men did. And now the geeks have become the great powers in both the technology geeks and the entertainment geeks. The most successful entertainment is Marvel superheroes, and the most successful companies are high-tech companies.
It's those online communities bringing people together in a way that kind of creates this mentality that the book's talking about.
But this is flaunting our quote, our superiority over the rest of humanity. You know, yes, we're superior and we know it, and we're going to use that.
If you got it, flaunt it.
Instead of holding ourselves back and trying to be nice to you non-geeks. That's the most gentle metaphor I've come up with compared to all the more militaristic and nationalistic ones. But
it's true.
And Jonathan Hickman, I would guess, I mean, he does his best to be polite and humble when I've seen him speak, but underlying it is a sense of his superiority.
Oh, yeah. No doubt.
Well, and the success of House of X and Powers of X has proven him yet again to be the superior person in the world of comics.
It's true. And I mean, like, he's already been beloved for a lot of the runs he's done and a lot of the work he's done. But there's something to this, and it was pointed out to me, like, when he's doing Avengers, any one of those stories, like, he could have interchanged a few of the characters or whatever, and it didn't really matter. But here, there's such a love of kind of the characters in the universe that he's bringing in that just, he cares more about X-Men than a lot of his other Marvel work.
This reminds me a lot of Black Monday Murders. Did you read that series? Only 2 trades ever came out, which is one of his more recent series at Image, which is about a cabal of Mammon, a literal god of greed, Mammon worshipping cultists who control the economy of the entire world for the past several hundred or thousand years. And all the evil machinations they do between the different houses that rule the economy of the world, and the sacrifices they make of other people and nations and such. But those people are completely evil. Huh? But here he's done the same story, but with people who are supposedly the heroes. Maybe that also colored my view of all of this. But for people who liked House of X and Powers of X, I think you should go seek out those 2 trades of Black Monday Murders. It's a similar kind of, and I really enjoyed it a lot. But I viewed it as a horror story, which I think it was intended to be. So, anyway, that's my suggestion to everyone, actually, to go out and read those 2 trades. Which of what you've read so far of the stuff spinning out of this, what do you recommend most to our listeners?
Well, like I said, Marauders, I think, is definitely a big one. And then, X-Men proper is pretty fun.
Is Hickman still writing X-Men proper?
He's doing X-Men proper, and he's doing New Mutants. Which is weird, because New Mutants has, like, the least to do with any of the rest of this.
Does it feature characters from the original New Mutants, or?
It does. And what's interesting about all these new series is they kind of do arcs where they'll focus on certain characters, and then they'll do another arc that might focus on some different characters. And so it's really focused on telling stories that, like, are compelling and interesting and are examining something different, and they've already played with the idea of someone coming in and executing Xavier, and then of course he's reborn. And
yeah, there was some reference in the POX book of how somehow Xavier can be reborn also by creating his own rebirth, because everyone else's rebirth is done by Xavier, by Xavier's power and combined with Cerebro to put a copy of their brain inside their new body.
Mm-hmm.
Or their soul somehow. Somehow it's a little more than just their brain, but their soul is involved.
Yep.
So how can he bring himself back to life? I couldn't wrap my mind around that, although they do say he can do it.
Yeah, they don't dive into the details of that too much, which is probably for the best.
Right. Well, it's also an amazing feat that someone has come along and pushed a Marvel franchise into a whole new zone rather than resetting things back to where it used to be.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't think of anything else that has done that.
I think Dan Slott did that with Spider-Man, but...
Okay, maybe he did. Yeah, since I haven't read the Spider-Man.
You may not be quite at this level, though. But, yeah. I do appreciate these kinds of shifts. And that's the thing, is you're talking about this. Eventually, this House of Cards will fall and, something closer to the status quo will happen, but...
Well, once the sales slump, a new way to rejigger sales is to speak to some nostalgia. So we'll try to make this a little more like Chris Claremont's X-Men now, or reset things to the good old days of Stan Lee and Jack Kirby.
Yeah, I don't think anybody wants to go that far back with X-Men.
Well, I think they were trying to do that a little bit with Bendis when he brought the original X-Men into our timeline. I never learned how they resolved that. Did they ever send those people back to their own time?
They did somewhere along the line.
So I never heard anyone talk about that for a long time. Like we were talking about the young Iceman outing the older Iceman.
Yeah, it's
And so I don't know when the young Iceman was out of the picture and gone.
Well, I just got a lot of the all new X-Men run, which is Bendis's run. So yeah. Maybe it's talked about more there.
I don't think he wrapped that up, but I guess I don't know because I didn't get to the end of his run either. So there's another run. I read about half of Bendis's run on the X-Men before I kind of petered out. I think because there were
fair.
Too many events. Too many events going on killed it.
Well, and Bendis on the X-Men, it was not his strongest stuff.
Yeah. Well, will the X-Men, because I don't know, there's some new event coming to Marvel called Incoming. Will the X-Men be sucked into that, and will that kind of ruin their storyline? Or will they be able to stay out of it?
I read like a blip about Incoming. Isn't Incoming about like a death of a certain character and most people are just trying to solve the mystery or something?
I actually don't know. I have no idea what it is. I just know that's the next thing. And then somewhere in the future is probably a big thing involving Null and Venom again.
And then will Null fight the Machine Menace in the... Right. See, that's the sort of intersection I want to see more of, is like, they set up all this, and then why not just have those two toys clunk at each other and let the pieces fall where they may.
Has anyone played with the Celestials recently? Because they seem very close to the closest thing to the...
They were mentioned here and there, but I don't think they're actually used.
You could probably tie the Celestials into these machine intelligences living inside black holes. Maybe they're like physical extensions of them sent out into the universe.
Maybe, I don't know.
To seed planets with humanoids who will eventually create machine life that will eventually take over and rejoin the mothership. I don't know. Now I'm just riffing.
Not bad. I haven't read much of the Celestials, so I don't know if that plays.
See, I had problems with this. Those were invented originally by Jack Kirby and the Eternals. Mm-hmm. And they come back to Earth every, 10 millennium or something to judge whether life on Earth is still worth keeping going or something. So I had trouble with the huge cosmicness of them. I have trouble with huge cosmicness beyond a certain point, even though I enjoy cosmic tales. But we will return. The universe will die, contract, expand, explode, but then the Silver Surfer will seed the stars back into the sky as he did at the end of Silver Surfer Black. And Matt and I will be reborn to do another podcast. Does that sound about right?
That sounds good. It sounds like we have a little bit of time to plan for the next one.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
All right.